Hello and welcome to Alive After Reading. I'm your host, Tim Niederreiter, and with me today is a new guest to the podcast, J.M. Shaw. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, J.M., what kind of stuff do you write, and what brings you here today? I guess what kind of projects are you working on lately?
So I've written and published the first 3 books in my magical fantasy series. It's got lots of action adventure because I'm very ADHD, so I like lots of things happening, keep me entertained. And it's got some supernatural and suspense elements in there. I've got romance, but I don't have spicy romance. And I've published the first 3. The first is the Ascension, second's Convergence, third is the Fractured Veil. And it kind of follows, there's our world, our time, and a coexisting magical realm, but there's a veil that separates us. We can't see or cross this veil. We don't have magic. But these creatures that do can and have it. They've been the source of inspiration for our mythologies. My main character, Callum Walker, is a young man born with the ability to use magic. He's trying to figure it out, make the most of it, and he gets embroiled in what's going on in the magical realm. And we follow him through the books as he's trying to figure out who he is, where he fits in, because he's too magic for our side, but too human for that side, and then try to master these abilities to survive.
Cool. Yeah, kind of got a classic urban fantasy or portal fantasy setup there. That's awesome. Yeah, nice. So what kind of creatures do you have beyond the veil over there? Because you mentioned the things live over there.
Oh yeah, well there's like the expected and magical realm, like elves, fairies, dwarves, but I got other things like orcs. I've got dryads, I've got harpies, there's a whole system of deities. But I've tried to go back to the grassroots and the original mythologies for all my characters.
Nice. So they're not like Tolkien elves, they're more close to whatever Norse elves or whatever. Or some other mythologies they're from. I think that's mostly where I remember elves from in old world mythologies.
I know because they have magic, they don't need technology. So it's a very medieval type setting.
Okay.
And every different class of beings have their own political system, religion, traditions, how they view nature, how they view humans. Yeah.
So are there humans that live in the magical world, or they're just or are the humans only on our side, basically, to start out?
The humans are only on our side. They don't know this magical realm exists. Okay. They can't cross this veil because they don't have magic. But there are creatures from this magical realm that can cross into our world. Yeah. And yes, some of them are not necessarily altruistic, and they're nefarious.
Oh, well, tell me about it. One of my series is. It's not quite the same thing, but it has an element that's similar. But the creatures in the other world are humans. They're just really nasty, and they have a few additional magical things going on. But that's the Makers series or whatever, and the Makers themselves not the nicest people in the world, turns out, or in any world in that series. But yeah, It's interesting because, I mean, okay, so when did you start writing this kind of stuff? Or have you always written fantasy?
I haven't always written fantasy. I've written in different genres like sci-fi. I've written some horror, thriller. Anything that's got a lot of that action adventure keeps me entertained is kind of fair game. But the only thing I haven't written on is history. I have a hard time staying awake. I don't write mystery. I'm not smart enough. And I don't write spicy romance because, honestly, nobody has that kind of stamina.
Yeah, probably not. I mean, the thing, it's interesting that you mentioned history there, but so have you written other kinds of nonfiction as well? Or is it just nonfiction is generally not in your wheelhouse?
Nonfiction's, it reminds me of writing essays for school, which was not enjoyable.
Yeah.
I prefer the fiction. I've always been kind of a what if person, so I've just it was my outlet to let my mind wander.
Yeah, so you started pretty young, I bet, right? That's what it sounds like.
Oh yeah. I started, I've been writing for now 32 years.
Wow.
And I'm going to date myself here, but I started writing on when my mom bought me a typewriter.
Okay. So you're a little older than me, despite appearances. No, I started out, I typed my first novel on a computer in the computer lab at my high school. So that should put things in perspective. They had computer labs when I was a kid. But
They didn't even have internet when I was a kid.
oh boy, yeah. Yeah, no, I grew up with the internet. I'm one of those millennials you've heard all those awful things about. No, and anyway, but I guess it is interesting to me. So when you look at the way writing has changed, you probably don't still write on a typewriter. I'd imagine that's pretty rare these days.
Oh no, I've got a computer. I'll write down notes in a notebook if I don't have access to my computer. But I type up on my computer.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I've written kind of by hook or by crook as much as possible sometimes, and it's only recently I came down to I prefer typing over dictation, which is how spoiled I am when it comes to tools. My dictation is like not that good compared to my writing either. Like I can tell the books I've written that when they get reviews, I can see the difference. Like people can tell the difference. They can't necessarily say this book was dictated and this book was typed, but the difference in the review averages is so crazy. With it's like okay, noticeably higher for books that weren't dictated. If I type the whole book, people like that a lot better. It turns out maybe because I've been doing that a lot longer. Anyway, do you so other than the basic physical stuff, are there any specific kind of techniques you use when you're writing? Yeah.
If I'm stuck trying to find to conceptualize, I visualize this as a video in my head and I'm just writing down what I see. Pardon me. But if I get stuck on something, I just can't visualize it. I'll put my headphones on. I'll go for a 2-hour walk. I'll come back. And as I'm walking, I'm just listening to music and playing it out in my head. But a lot of times I'll just let myself just sort of, my creativity just sort of flow. And sometimes it leads me places that are amazing. I'm just like, wow, that's amazing. I didn't even think about that. And then other places I stop and I have to question my sanity.
Sometimes it's a good place to be, though. You know, sometimes the sanity questioning can be helpful. Not the part where you actually do the questioning, the part that leads you there. I mean, because at least with me, I mean, I experienced something similar. Definitely getting exercise really helps me out. And when I approach writing something, I always listen to something in my headphones when I'm writing. And usually it's like heavy metal, death metal type stuff. But sometimes it can be a podcast, it can be just a soundtrack. It can vary so much. But the one people think is the strangest probably is that I've listened to so many podcasts while writing fiction. So anyway, I just think it's I'm a little rusty on this, I guess, because I've been sitting by myself for so long. No, I guess my point is that we approach things. We seem to approach things in a fairly similar way, but they're all the little differences that I think they actually do kind of bear out in the story a lot of the time. All those little things make the stories. You write yours, and once I write mine, that kind of thing. So yeah, and you've done a pretty good job summarizing so far. You like your action and adventure and your speculative stuff. So I guess, are there any like themes, those pesky themes that tend to come out in your books these days?
So most of the readers are reading it because they like the action and stuff, but they don't realize I do weave in those like wholesome messages, dealing with like mental health, the, talking things out, the importance of family and friends, overcoming your inner demons and those kind of stuff in an adventure setting. So it's entertaining, but it's also enlightening.
Right. Yeah. It's actually interesting because those sort of themes are often the kind of things I see explored in like the animation. I enjoy that kind of stuff, as well as other stories, obviously. But and honestly, the themes in my work aren't that different either. Honestly, I mean, I write though. People have accused my work sometimes of being a little weird, maybe a little unusual.
There's nothing wrong with weird.
I'm mostly joking about accused there. Yeah, I like it that way. But sometimes you need to fall back to basics. And recently I've been writing a couple short stories for one of my settings, which is kind of like an Egyptian samurai fusion thing. And it's a little out there maybe, but it's high fantasy. It's high fantasy, so it's not really it's not historical fiction or anything. Just inspired by those two cultures woven together. And I've noticed a few things about about writing that I really liked lately, and one of them is how much I enjoy just kind of discovering the sentence at the sentence level, because I'm definitely not an outliner, right? So when I not that there's
I'm a pantser as well.
There's nothing wrong with outlining, but it just isn't either of our style. But I've noticed that I'll frequently go back and just like revise a few words here and there in a sentence when I'm getting back into it in the morning. You know, when I'm getting back into the fiction side of things.
You can go play your games.
Sorry to disturb you.
No.
Can we install?
Fine. Install one.
Just a second here, people. We got some. There's this. Just a second.
We had some children interference there.
Yes. Don't worry, I muted that for the most part. Yeah. Or you did. I actually wasn't sure. But no. That anyway. What was I saying? I guess fun is really the important thing I'm noticing. Is when I'm enjoying my writing, I notice my readers tend to like those stories better. The ones I really, really had some fun with. It's not even about what I put into them. It's like it's how much they're giving me will shine through, which is kind of a weird it's kind of a weird way to look at it compared to how a lot of people say, how it takes effort to create stories and stuff. Well, that's true, but sometimes it takes effort to have a good time too, to have fun.
Mm-hmm. I know my curse right now is because I have been editing and learning my writing craft, and I've been stuck in editing mode so much that now it's hard to get back into that creative mode without editing what I'm writing as I go.
Yeah.
And that kind of sucks some of the fun out of it.
Yeah. But actually, lately, I mean, I don't know, you've been writing for longer than me, about half again as long as me. But have you ever heard of Dean Wesley Smith's writing advice for pantsers or Discovery?
I can't say that I have.
So he had this piece of advice, which is, that a lot of authors I know kind of espouse it. Terry Mixon, J. Daniel Sawyer, these kind of guys, but they, incidentally, all of them older white dudes. But anyway, well, I mean, I guess not Dan. He's not that old. But anyway, these guys, they all are they kind of have all espoused the writing for going cycling, I think is what they call it. And I've tried, and that's where you go back and you gradually just revise stuff as you go, kind of stuff. Like you go back a paragraph and you may see if there's anything you need to fix every now and then. And I found that was like almost impossible for me to do when I first heard about it. And now I just find myself kind of automatically doing something like that a lot of the time, and I feel like I got very comfortable editing lately. So that's been my recent kind of skill up kind of situation. So maybe, but definitely getting stuck in editing mode was an issue I had for a long time. I mean, it's been, and it probably will be again, mind you. So
it seems to be a cycle. It comes around.
Exactly. And I mean, when you're editing a work, how is it really different from writing it? Obviously you're not writing lots of new sentences necessarily, but I found the difference just isn't striking me the same way lately.
Well, I was trying to learn a lot of, I didn't pay attention in high school. I've just been create, but I was never looking at like sentence structure and, like show, don't tell. It's kind of been, the last few years have been huge learning curve for me once I decided to publish. And so when I'm editing, I'm looking at sentence structures. I'm looking at comma splices. I'm looking at, do I have too many body beats? Are they frowning too much? I had one editor come back and says, there's an awful lot of sighing going on. Is your character asthmatic? So I'm looking at those things from a reader's perspective.
Right. No, that makes sense. And the repetition of especially gestures and sighs and things can be really, really distracting as a reader. And yet, as an author, it's so easy to slip those in a little over much or even a lot too much. I mean, I've done it before. I'm not sure if I'll do it anytime soon, but who knows? Check my watch. Maybe it's not time yet.
Yeah. Relying too heavily on spell checker is I have dyslexia. And so when I'm writing and I'm in the zone and I'm hurrying, sometimes I'll mix my words up.
Yeah.
And the spell checker is not always your friend, because I went to have my character go and assess the situation on this rampart, but I missed one of the S's at the end there. And my editor comes back and is like, why is there multiple donkeys out here?
Yeah. Sometimes some words are just, they're misspelled, but they're not misspelled. Yeah. They spelled something else instead. No, yeah. I used Grammarly for a while there, and things like Pro Writing Aid because I had such a hard time learning commas, and I was an English major in college. Like I studied English at a reasonable level, and I was like, nah, I don't know how to use a comma. Couldn't do it, even after college. But I've stopped using those tools. But I learned a lot about comma use from their corrections, especially for fiction. I thought that was pretty handy, but I mean, I don't have dyslexia, so it's a little different, obviously, for me.
Yeah, I know some of my vowel teams kind of screw me up sometimes, and I have to have little rhymes like 2S day instead of Tuesday, so that I know which one to go first.
Yeah. Yeah, with my last name, I've learned a lot about silent letters in my life.
Yes, I hate silent letters.
My last name is pronounced Niederreiter. But it's spelled Nieder. Yeah. Anyway, just for listeners who have but most of my listeners have probably heard that one before, because getting people to spell my name has been a part of the challenge of being an independent author. Anyway, but as far as publishing, how did you go about doing that part of the process? Have you looked for an agent or what? Yeah.
I did. I spent some time looking for an agent and some publishing companies, and I did get a couple of letters of offer, but they wanted to take the rights. They wanted to own it. And I'm like, these are my creations. It's like selling my children. So they also wanted to change things in them. They wanted to break the books down, but they didn't want cliffhangers. And I was like, there's no good place to break it. You're going to have one or the other. But to me, it just felt wrong to be changing this, because, it's like buying the Mona Lisa and drawing eyebrows on her. It's my art. It's my creations. And I wrote it this way. If you change something, I got to change it all the way through after that.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just really control freak or something, but I ended up self-publishing.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with being a little bit controlling when it comes to your writing. I think that's pretty normal. So I haven't heard a lot of people gone to that extent of like, I had a deal on the table and I'm like, nah, I think I'll go without. but that's pretty gutsy there.
Yeah. Well, I also thought that if I'm going to have to do all of the work myself anyway, which is, try to build a social media presence, figure out how to tell the world I exist and all that stuff, I'm going to have to do that anyway for less commission, like less royalties.
Right.
Why wouldn't I just do it myself? And then I found out that, it was a learning process, but once I get everything set in place, it's a lot easier to do the subsequent books.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I started publishing in 2015, and there's been a lot of ups, mostly downs for me, honestly, in that process. It's really challenging. It's been really challenging to learn it and figure that out. And I think I'm finally getting my handle on it, but
yes,
I got to tell you, I'm impressed with anybody who makes a dent in their first 10 books, let alone their first 3, getting them out there, making sales and stuff, getting an audience together, because I've published 22 books and none of them are doing super well yet.
Yeah. Well, I figure it's like somebody on my last book signing, they said, "Oh, you're doing really good." They're like giving me the thumbs up and stuff. And I know they're just being supportive because they didn't even stop and look at my books. Right. And I just told them, I said, I'm in for, it's a marathon, not a race.
Right. Yeah. It's not a sprint. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. Let me see. So do you have other story ideas, other series ideas that going for you, or are you mostly set in? Okay. You said you'd written a wide variety of stuff. So.
Yeah. I've penned hundreds and hundreds of stories. I've got hard drives full of ideas that I've done over the years, but I only became published in 2021. Okay. So I'm going back and revising some things and I've learned a lot. So when I look back at some of my early works, it's very cringy.
Yeah. That's a tough phase to get through with the early stuff.
Yeah.
I got this one, recently I've been looking at this one series and I'm like, Well, it's not really one series. It was a bunch of different books. I'm like, wait, these could all fit together to be a series of my older work. And I just think that's kind of, it's like, man, this is going to be a lot of editing.
Yes.
Yeah. So when you approach older work at all, have you ever considered going back and digging out some of the, like, old novels or whatever and publishing them? And with edits,
yeah.
of course.
I've actually
clean up.
Yeah, I've been looking at it. I don't know if it's harder to create something new or if it's to revise something you've already written. If I remember what idea I had in place and where I was going with it, then it's probably just easier to rewrite it all.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was just working on it. I was just on a YouTube channel where it was an AuthorTube channel or whatever, and one of the bigger ones, I think it's Shaylin Writes, and she just had this video about how she'd just written a book, first fantasy book in a long time, and she didn't like it. Like, oh crap! But the thing is, when you're, I don't want to say she's a slow writer, but when you're a lot slower than when you're you're not writing longer. Well, when you haven't written that many books, really, when you've written like 10 books and not 40 books, right? Compared to somebody who's been doing this for years and years versus somebody who's younger at it. It does seem like a lot worse of a thing to have to be like, oh crap, I got to write this book again if I want to make it good because it just didn't get there. But I've been there. I've been in that place, and I've done the thing where I'm like, okay, I guess I just got to do it because I already wrote book one. Book one was fine. People like that, so I better make book two good. But then I wrote book two, and it wasn't good. Now I'm like, now I need to write it again. Yeah.
Well, I know I had somebody, when somebody came to me and asked me, it's like, oh, well, which one is your best book? I've only got
that's
3
a
out
weird
right
question.
now. And I was like, that's like asking me to choose between my children. But I said, when I wrote the first book, The Ascension, I thought that was a really good book. I'm like, this is the one I'm going to publish, which I did. That was my first one published. And then I wrote The Convergence, was the second book. And I thought, wow, this is really good. And then I wrote the third book, about broke me, but I wrote the third book and I was like, wow, this one's really good. So they do kind of get, I think that I feel like they get better as time, but I think what it is my writing is getting better and I'm becoming more comfortable in my writer's voice. Cause I just finished my developmental edit on my 4th novel. And I'm looking back at some of those things. It's like, that's where did I come up with that idea? That's pretty good.
Isn't that's a great feeling.
I like that sentence. How did I do that?
Right. Yeah. Because it's not something I think even what is it? Plotters don't know how they do the little stuff. They don't think about all the little things they're doing when they're actually writing a sentence or a paragraph.
Yes.
But I guess that's the weirdest part about writing. You kind of step aside for a moment, and then at least that's what it feels like to me. Sometimes it's like I'm here, I'm typing on the keyboard, and it's almost like a dissociation, right? You're somewhere else.
Yes.
And you're coming up with different stuff and thinking about what it'd be like in that situation instead of being where you actually are, which is at a keyboard.
Yeah. And I don't know how you, but I don't know if you do this, but I know my characters upside down, forwards, backwards, sideways. And I envision as like, oh, I wonder if my main character is a cat person or a dog person. Kind of some random things like that. Or how would they react if they were in that situation?
Right.
That kind of thing. So as if they are real, but I know they're not real.
Of course, yeah. No, that's interesting. I tend to I feel like I know my characters kind of like they're, honestly at this point, kind of like they're friends, which means I don't know everything about them, but I know enough that I can have a good guess at what they'll be like in a given situation. That's kind of what I count on them for. I don't, maybe it's because I have a little autism, but, and I was diagnosed autistic. I don't necessarily like when people just say I'm autistic. I guess, I am, but there I go, gatekeeping. But what my point is, my point is though, is like, I feel like I don't know people that well. And when I was learning to write, I didn't know people very well at all. Because I started as a teenager, right? I was like, okay, I'm 14 and I've just been diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorder 2 years ago or whatever. Well, that's when my first book got wrapped up. I finished writing my first novel then, and I'm like, that. Of course, that kid didn't know anything about writing or people, and he still managed to write a book. That was kind of crazy. But people, that's the same with everybody in any situation. Really, is like how do new parents do it, right? That kind of thing. It's a
Yeah.
kind of
Well, I
a
know,
miracle. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. I know I've always been sort of a misfit, never feeling like I fit in. So I did a lot of people watching. And then in 2019, I was diagnosed with autism and ADHD as well. And then I thought, I've been writing for so long. I would not have become published had I not been diagnosed, because I thought, well, maybe that's my special interest. And that's what gave me the courage to say, okay, I'm going to take my first manuscript. I'm going to send it off to an editor. The worst they can say is it sucks, but I'd never shared anything to that point. And if they say it sucks, then I'll know and I'll just write for myself. Yeah. But they came back and said, no, this doesn't suck. You should publish. So that's what I did. But had I not been diagnosed with autism and ADHD, and I never would have taken that step.
Yeah. I've also got an ADHD diagnosis, but just comparing notes here. But, and the thing is, when I found the medication, we found the medication that really worked for me when I was a kid, especially for the ADHD, that's when I started writing. Like, I wrote my first book almost immediately after I started taking that medication. So I do get annoyed with people who will say that the medications are, the ADHD isn't real, or or medications are unnecessary for it. Like, I mean, define unnecessary, right? There was a kid who always wanted to be a writer, and there's the kid who wrote his first book. And one of them was medicated and the other one wasn't. That's the big difference there. I mean, maybe I would have written it if I hadn't been medicated. I kind of have a feeling I wouldn't have, There's a big difference.
Well, I know I was going through, and this is what started me with the writing, I was going through a lot of emotional and mental health issues and getting picked on in school, and I needed that outlet, and it just sort of became my outlet. Then it became a hobby, then a passion, and now it's my obsession, but it's also cheaper than therapy, and it's a part of me now. Yeah. So
that is a really good point. What we start out doing something and it's just kind of like, I could give that a try, and then it becomes this is a fun pastime or a hobby, and now it's okay. This is what I do. This is my thing. I think we're both pretty much at that point with writing, and that's good to hear, because frankly, when you're alone and you're an isolated creative of any kind, and you feel like, at least I definitely felt this way. It's like, well, is there anybody who's as into this crap as I am?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, I write the stories that come from my heart. They're stories I want to hear. They're an expression of me. What I didn't realize is my whole journey about my character trying to find out where they fit in, where they belong, because they don't belong on either side of the veil and stuff. And somebody at one of my book signings says, hey, that kind of mirrors your journey, trying to figure out where your place in this world, in navigating society through your autism. And I was like, oh my gosh, it totally is.
Yeah, right? Yeah. And, I've noticed that kind of thing where the different books, because I mean, I only wrote a few books a year for the most of my life, right? But each book was like a season. I could look back and see, like, this is what was happening at that point, right? I was about to move on from high school, or I was just learning that I was good at stuff, kind of thing. Like, I finally felt confident in my skills and the ability to progress, that kind of thing.
Yes.
And then the books adopted those themes by virtue of me having them on my mind as I wrote them.
Yes.
Yeah. So
well, I know I had somebody.
No, you go on.
I know a lot of people will put themselves into, like, aspects of themselves into their characters that they're writing. And I had somebody ask me if I was writing my main character, Callum Walker, as if that was me. And I said, I don't think I could survive. I think if I met my main character, he'd want to strangle me for all the crap I put him through. I don't think that that's my main character, but I think he's got some bits of my personality. But then so do all my other characters, and they're kind of elements of my own personality.
Yeah, definitely. The thing I've noticed is I prefer to work with the elements of my own personality when I'm writing. It's similar to what you just described, versus using other people or basing a character on somebody else. Because I find that that's more dangerous, because guess what? You don't always have somebody else, right?
Yep.
As long as you're alive, you have you to work with. Yeah.
Exactly. And I mean, you can observe a person all you want, but you don't know what's going on inside their head.
Right.
So you only know what's going on inside your head. So you can envision yourself in those situations. Like, if I envision myself riding on the back of a dragon, I can't actually ride on the back of a dragon, but I can imagine what it would be like to have the wind blowing through my hair. I can imagine, because I've been in a situation with the airplanes taking off and your stomach kind of sinks. And then I can relate that to that experience in being creative.
Absolutely. Do you find it ever tricky to get that, to communicate a situation like the plane thing? I guess it's not so hard, at least with this story you're telling, because the character's from a world with planes. He might go into a world that has dragons or whatever other flying creatures.
Yes. Well, he goes into the magical realm, and it's very much not a modern world for him.
Right. But because he's from our world or whatever, he knows what a plane is. But what I was getting at is there's some trickier situations there. There's a trickier writing situation where it's like, wait a minute, planes don't exist in this world, so he doesn't have a comparison, for example, and something that it's that kind of stuff. That's what I'm thinking about. You run into anything quite like that in your work so far?
There's. That's where I grab my headphones and go for my long walks. And try to envision it in my head. If I can visualize it, there's some things where I have to take a picture sometimes, like when I'm trying to describe a location. I will go and I'll look for a picture as something I can see, something tangible. I can either see it, feel it, or a place that I've been and I can kind of but a lot of times it's, if I can't picture in my head, I have to do something different.
Right. That makes sense. I mean, I've definitely had trouble picturing some of my settings, my weird worlds and stuff in my head, and getting them across to other people can be kind of staggeringly difficult sometimes with how weird some of my geography gets.
Yeah.
But anyway, So, what have you got going forward? Future projects? Anything in the immediate future for you, other than maybe more books in this series?
Yeah, well, my fourth book is in editing right now, and it's going to be released early next year. I am starting on my fifth book in this series, just starting with the rough draft on it and kind of revising it because I had most of it done, but I'm just revising and doing some changes. And then I'm considering stepping into another genre and doing another book, possibly sci-fi, maybe even paranormal or horror. And just try to flex my muscles in those areas.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's fun to like you said, to flex. You got to move around, expand the space, right?
Yes.
I've got this short story I'm writing. It's up for pre-order on Halloween, and I'm almost done with it. But I realized that this, I set it up for a Halloween release because it's in that kind of Egyptian samurai fusion setting that I've been working on a novel in that setting, and I released just another short story there. But I'm like, okay, I decided if I'm going to set up a pre-order, it's going to be on Halloween, and it's going to be scarier than the last story. I'm going to try to make it kind of horror, and that is so tricky in a short story. But it also is tricky in a novel, and there's just different level of challenges. The thing I'm getting at here, though, is when I wrote the first short story, sorry, I'm a step away from getting at it, but when I wrote the first short story in this setting, I kind of had a revelation about short stories, and it was that they don't have to be that different from writing a novel, because they are still they have to still be one of my things, or one of your stories if you were writing it, right? They still have to fit those themes, those concepts, and those kind of elements that you like to see, right? Or you're not going to be excited about it. That's what I was telling myself this anyway. And
well, that's a passion, right?
Right, exactly. But there's all this short story advice out there about how you should only include X number of things. I mean, or like there's a limited amount of space in the short story, so you need to really pare it down. Like that piece of advice, good advice, but sometimes it doesn't work. Like, I mean, I just, or in some stories you just can't pare out that much material, or there's world building that has to be done. Or these characters, there needs to be 5 characters in this short story. I'm not sure how it's going to work, but it worked.
There's just some history that you have to put in that takes up space, but it's necessary for it.
Exactly. And I guess what I'm getting at here, and this was what I thought I was getting at before, is when I try to write something and it doesn't fit my passion, it's not what it's driven me to be a writer in the first place, or what's driving me to be a writer in that moment. Oof, that is when it comes out like crap. That is always the hardest one to write. And when it's hard to write, it's not like hard work gets you all the way there, at least not for me.
Yeah, it's not fun anymore, and it kind of saps the, you lose your creative connection to
Right.
it.
Yeah. And even when I finish a work like that, it usually doesn't turn out well.
Yeah, it's more like writing an essay at that point, isn't it?
Right. And I mean, of course, that doesn't quite work for me as a comparison because I like writing essays every now and then. But it's like more like writing. It's for me. It's like writing another essay about Jude the Obscure or some other Thomas Hardy story that I'm not a huge fan of. So I definitely see where you're going there. Excuse me. Almost had a guest host on for a second there. Anyway, no politics. But yeah, other than getting a frog in my throat, I think we might actually have wrapped things up a little earlier than I expected. But yeah, J.M. Shaw. Anything else you want to? Any advice you'd offer new authors or people who really are just getting into this thing?
I'd say that persistence is important, and just know that you're not going to be able to write something that's going to meet everybody's needs. There's going to be people that just don't like it, and you just have to take their advice with a grain of salt. And I do read the comments that people leave, the reviews that people leave about my books, and for the most part, they're pretty, pretty positive. I think I had one where they just didn't like my character; they thought he was a loser. But I can't take that to heart because, I'm not going to please everybody.
Right.
Maybe they just didn't like that genre. Maybe they thought the cover looked good and the synopsis and the back looked good, but then they read it through and it didn't spark intrigue in them and stuff. But people are allowed, if you want the freedom to have your own likes and dislikes, you have to accept that others are going to have their own as well.
Good advice, definitely. Yeah. So once again, what's the names of the books you have out, and where can people find you online?
Yeah, so you can find my it's probably on my website here. It's www.jmshawauthor.com, and you'll find all my books with their synopsis. You'll find links to them available on Amazon. They're also on Kobo. They're on Barnes & Noble if you're in the US, and lulu.com. And if you're in local in Alberta, they're in 11 different Indigo Chapters locations across Alberta, and one small store in Calgary called the Owl's Nest.
Ooh, the Owl's Nest. Nice. So, yeah, thanks for once again for being on the show. That's been fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
All righty, people. As for this podcast, you know where to find it. Just right now, it's Libsyn.com or the Libsyn feed, where you're probably listening to this or downloaded it already. That's where you can find it, or on your favorite podcatchers. My website is timneedawriter.com, as in N-E-E-D, writer.com. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye-bye, everybody.